and welcome to Media Monitor, and our apologies for starting a little bit later than usual, but we still have lots for you to watch and enjoy on the program, so stay with us. And in fact, our first story is quite a fascinating one, and we'll start with our first guest, and we'll be chatting about the need for journalists to listen more. And Associate Professor Glenda Daniels joins me now to unpack what that means. Thanks very much indeed for joining me, Professor Daniels. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Peter. Thank you for having me.
So what is listening journalism? I thought that journalists listen all the time.
Perhaps this new book by Professor Herman Wasserman is saying that, yes, journalists are meant to listen, and yes, they do, but they need to listen a lot more, rather than to be imposing a very overly mediated view of what they think is happening. So that's the number one thing. Number two, he's talking about peace journalism. So peace journalism means you can actually be part of communities and play a role in conflict. So in other words, in minimizing conflict rather than adding to conflict. You know, the adding to conflict in journalism would be two binary oppositions. He said, she said, he said, she said, as though they're always these two very different things. So, you know, it's a very interesting take on journalism in the sense of we shouldn't have global North values just imposed upon Africa and the global South. We should be creating our own value system, and that's what ethics for him means. It means that let's look at things in another way. Let's not always look at things from the point of view of professional codes of ethics. Professional codes of ethics, in his view, means objectivity, neutrality, and so forth. Rather, you know, let's not be so outside as journalists, outside of communities, and let's be part of it.
That's fascinating to me. And I suppose it works when you're talking a community paper that's writing for a homogeneous community, because then one understands the values and so on and so forth. But what do you do in a city like Johannesburg, in a city newspaper? What do you do on a public broadcaster like the SABC, which is a national, maybe even transnational mandate? Because then the communities are all different, aren't they?
Absolutely correct, Peter. It's disparate communities. So, in fact, Johannesburg itself is not just one community, obviously. There are class structures, there are gender structures, there's the LGBTQI plus movement, there's the feminist movement, there are climate change activists. So in fact, from this point of view, what this kind of framework, ethical framework would mean is to cover as many voices as possible to get a diverse set of views in. So that, for instance, with the SABC, it can't always be about just President Cyril Ramaphosa's views, or just the ANC, or just the ANC and the DA, because there's so many other things happening. So this makes life for journalists extremely difficult, life for a public broadcaster extremely difficult. It's not easy. These are tensions that are ongoing and are not going to be solved overnight. But at least there needs to be thinking, discussion, debate about new concepts and new ideas, because you can't keep doing things the same way, same old, and people are continually criticizing journalism for whatever reason. This reason, it's not like this, it's not doing enough of that, journalists should do this, journalism should do that. Nonetheless, even with the criticisms, we get new frameworks, new theoretical frameworks, new ways of looking and new ways of seeing, and one must take this into account and see how one can incorporate it. The communities in Yeovil, for instance, are not quite the same as the elite communities of Houghton, yet they sit side by side. It's not quite in Gauteng, the elite of the powers that be with government ministers and so forth are not quite the same as homeless communities in Alexandra, or people who are building shacks there. So we really are such a diverse country, and we have to have a diverse journalism as well.
All right. I am intrigued. At the beginning, we talked about not trying to follow Western or global values, that we need perhaps to look at our own value system in our journalism. Give me some thoughts about what that might look like in terms of what then is South African or African journalism compared to Fleet Street or somewhere else.
Well, I think in terms of, say, for instance, one wants to do a decolonial analysis of a particular issue, one then must take into account women and how they are, or black women, and how they are right at the bottom of the pile of hierarchies, structural hierarchies in society. Yeah. And rather than looking at just freedom of expression, or looking at the issue of a lack of Ubuntu in the North and how they would look at Africa. So should we be doing exactly the same thing, where black bodies are just portrayed in different media stations, in the North especially, African black bodies lying on the floor after war and bloodied and objectified, and it's cruelty to humanity, to Africa. So we can, in Africa, in our particular instance of South Africa, look at how one treats one's subjects, not as objects, but as part of humanity. Yeah. And not always portray the same narratives of starvation when there are other things happening on the continent as well. Then, as I was saying earlier, the issue of neutrality and objectivity. Aren't we, or aren't journalists also a part of communities? Shouldn't they be more embedded and listening to communities? I give one example in the article of the town halls or community dialogues in the Eastern Cape, where journalists and editors and community members got together and sat down weekly, sometimes monthly. What are the issues in the community that we should be taking up as this particular newspaper? It was the Herald when Heather Robertson was there as editor. And that became quite an important exercise. And it did inform to some extent the news diary. A lot of journalists and a lot of editors and newspapers didn't run with the idea, so it hasn't caught on. At the same time, one has to acknowledge the fact of huge retrenchments and how media is so under threat from a lack of revenue, circulation, profits, etc. So journalists are put under pressure to do more. Companies are often not giving that kind of support because they're not looking at imaginative ways of solving the problem, nor at imaginative ways where journalists and editors come up with interesting ideas like the community dialogues and town halls, and then they're not resourced time-wise and money-wise to actually do those sort of things that are important. That is what is a good example of listening journalism.
I mean, this is fascinating, and I guess it starts to ask the question is, journalists now, we're always trying to be objective, but perhaps we're not always because of what we are listening to or what we think we're hearing. Does it start with you, Professor, in how you teach your journalists? Because by and large, we've got Western textbooks, don't we? And we bring them into the classroom and we start the process there.
Yes. So that is one issue. So we do have Western textbooks, but in the last decade or so, there's a huge plethora of new textbooks being written in the Global South and by Global South scholars all over the world. I have, for instance, Zimbabwean professors all over the world who are writing books on decolonization, decolonialism, the global South gaze, etc. But, Peter, there's only so much academics can do. You can teach journalists in a certain way, journalist students, then they go into a newsroom, and as you would know, each newsroom and each news organization and media company has a particular culture. And it's very, very hard to go in there and say, my professor taught me this, and this is how we should do things. So there's a big gap, there's a big chasm between what happens in the academic field and when you actually go into the newsroom itself. You get swallowed in by that culture. You go in there as a feminist thinking, well, I will make sure I am supportive of women's voices. I will bring in more women experts, and it won't just be all the powers that be, only, the ends. Okay. It won't be that. It will be more than that. I will look deliberately for women to interview. And you get there and you find that it's not that it's not supported, but it's not taken seriously. And in order to survive, you find a lot of feminist journalists would just get swallowed up by the bigger culture of what has existed for many decades already.
I suppose also, because we started this talking about not adding harm, particularly in peace journalism. And I can already see that even that might even have its challenges, because there are two sides often to conflicts. And if you try to be fair, that means exposing even a side that you perhaps belong to. Let's say I'm a Muslim journalist in Israel. I may upset my Arab brothers if I say, actually, you know what, this is what Palestinians are also doing. So it brings its own challenges, doesn't it? Because yes, you can listen and be sensitive, but you can also become vulnerable by being fair.
Absolutely. So yes, I hear what you're saying, especially in as you're talking about the Arab-Jewish conflict in the Palestinian issue. You're vulnerable, and in fact, journalists are always vulnerable, because you're not going to be always writing about peace journalism and how to bring parties together to reach consensus. Life is full of conflict. Life is full of war in all sorts of ways and at different levels. And you're always going to be a target. And people who go into this craft, some call it a profession, into the craft of writing for the publics, know that full well. I'm not saying that excuses the fact that journalists get killed and they get vilified, especially online and in regions such as the Middle East and Africa, also the South Latin American countries. You get killed for exposing drug cartels in Mexico, for example. So you're going to be a target. And the mission that you would go into this for in the first place would be a public service function. It always has to be. It never should be for anything else. The public good,
Glenda, I'm going to jump in there because I've got to ask you one last question, but I hope you can answer quite quickly. Local government elections are coming up, and these are perhaps a lot more important than ever before because of what we've seen in the country. How do journalists pick up this kind of journalism? Typically, what kind of articles do you want to see and stories want to hear in the lead up to these elections?
Well, as much as we're talking right now about the ethics of engagement and etc., I also believe in watchdog journalism. So the biggest issue right now is a lack of service delivery to all the communities. People have to be interrogated about who they're voting for and why. Do they keep voting for the same old thing and not getting delivery of water service, services of electricity, housing, etc.? So the journalists really have a duty to inform people about what their rights are, not who they should vote for, but what their rights are and are they getting it, who are they voting for. And in fact, obviously, the voting process itself, people sometimes don't even know where to go, whether they tick or they cross ballot boxes. that kind of function of journalism will remain forever important, the informative role and the educative role.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor on the SABC News channel. Financial journalism as a mode of communicating economic ideas has probably never been as important as it is now. And that's according to a communications expert, Khanyisa Melwa. Melwa notes how we're living in an increasingly complex world that is typified by high levels of inequality, tectonic shifts in geopolitical power, a pandemic that has stolen millions of lives, rapid technological advancements, a climate crisis and multiple financial crises caused by late-stage capitalism. Now, all of these events disproportionately affect the most disadvantaged in our societies, whilst the elite, well, by and large, they're able to continue with their lives relatively unscathed. And this is why it's so important to have a financial media whose coverage is truly in the public interest. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Khanyisa Melwa to tell us what his thoughts are on this subject. So, Khanyisa, you penned this article, which means that something was going on in your mind that concerned you quite a bit. What sparked that?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. So I think from a financial journalism perspective, right, as we spoke offline just now, is that financial journalism is often spoken of as, this niche branch of journalism that only certain people are allowed to speak about. Only certain people are allowed to, speak about economics and business, whereas the impact of what happens in our financial system is so far reaching and actually impacts the majority of South Africans, which, the majority of South Africans are, mostly black and mostly poor and live in townships. Yet the way in which financial journalists write about, the political economy, write about financial markets, comes from a very elitist and middle class to upper class perspective. And that's always sort of gnawed at me. And it's something that I've always sort of agitated against when it comes to financial journalism. I've always sought to think about ways in which we could sort of change that and find ways in which we could communicate economic ideas in a much more palatable and accessible fashion. So that's where sort of that the piece sort of comes from.
So typically, what is financial journalism? Help us unpack that, because that means different things to different people. I think before I did a bit of financial journalism, I always thought it was the business section of the Star. I thought it was that pink paper that when you walk onto the stands, there's that paper called The Times. And I just thought, that is what it is. And all I'm going to see there are markets, share prices, and currencies. But I suppose there's a lot more to it. Help us understand what financial journalism is.
Sure. So in the piece, I quote Jeffrey Timmermans, who's a former financial journalist and a current lecturer at the University of Hong Kong. And essentially how he defines it, and it's a definition that I identify with quite strongly, is that it's essentially reporting on, financial markets and movements within the financial system and the financial sector that sort of helps to illuminate, those complexities within economics as well as politics, right? And what it's supposed to essentially do is that it's supposed to give you the kind of information that empowers you to make informed decisions from a financial perspective, taking into consideration your context from a political economy perspective.
All right. So why is it more important now than ever before?
I think we're going through, or we're in, very, very strange times at the moment. You quoted a piece of the article earlier where, we've got high levels of inequality, tectonic shifts in, geopolitical power between the US and China, who are competing for, who's going to be the superpower. We've got a pandemic at our hands that is, has stolen so many lives. So there's so many things happening globally, and at a South African level, South African perspective, we have a government that doesn't know where it's going, whether it's going left, right, or center. We have astronomically high levels of unemployment. waning investor confidence. We have a finance minister that, doesn't really want to be a finance minister, would rather be a food or travel blogger than a bureaucrat. So all of these complexities require, in my opinion, a financial media that helps us make sense of this changing world that we're living in. There's so many things happening. And I think a financial media, like I said earlier, that prioritizes and centers, the on Main Street in Joburg CBD, as opposed to, a Josh on Catherine Street in Sandton. So it needs to prioritize the majority of South Africans as opposed to, the elite.
All right. So, I can understand nicheism, if there's such a word. So I know what I'm going to get when I tune into CNBC and Business Day Television, and I expect to see that. But I suppose when you tune into the public broadcaster, one of the challenges in the past and throughout, I think, is this otherism of certain types of journalism. So sport is always seen separate to news, and it's given a slot. Business has been treated in the same way. It's given a slot and it's othered. And I wonder if we should actually mainstream it so that one gets an appreciation of its value to everybody. Otherwise, as soon as I see Nzinga and I know that she's doing business, I might get scared and tune out.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. And I think furthermore, I think there also needs to be talk and thinking around, a financial media and financial journalism that really works from the perspective of the working class and the poor, right, in terms of understanding its audience and speaking to an audience that prioritizes, the working class, as opposed to, financial journalism that perpetually prioritizes, people who are more educated and who are earning a certain, at a certain tax bracket. So, I completely agree with you. And I think, it's really important to sort of center working class business journalism and business news where people can actually be included as opposed to being excluded as it is at the moment.
All right, so give me an example. I'm Livan Mhlari. I'm a laborer in Seshego in Limpopo. What should they be writing for me, and how should they be writing for me financial journalism? Give me a practical example.
Cool. So I think, look, at the moment, if you look at the current titles, the business days of this world, financial mails and stuff, that kind of news will obviously, be elevated at, a financial markets and speaking about business news at that level, whereas there are certain bread and butter issues that a Livan Mhlari from, Limpopo is more interested in, so what is happening in their communities, for example, what businesses are currently in their spaces and how they contribute to their communities. But also if you want to communicate macroeconomic information, doing that in a fashion that's going to allow a laborer and someone from Limpopo, who might not have an education, like a bachelor's degree in economics or whatever, to understand that information clearly. And, how do we break down, macroeconomic policy for people who don't have a high level of education to simply understand that, because, it means so much and it affects their lives in such a significant way.
Yeah, I suppose, sometimes we do daily rates, currencies, the rand is XYZ, and there isn't a great appreciation actually that even if you're not a forex trader, that rate is affecting my life right at the lowest levels of economic activity.
Yeah, 100%. I agree.
So what do we need to start to do more of as papers, as broadcasters, to mainstream financial journalism? I would even say maybe we need to change the name.
Yeah, that's a possible solve. But I think, one of the ways is what I said earlier is simply changing sort of the ideological outlook and sort of creating content again that centers and prioritizes the working class and the people who matter the most, who are the majority of South Africans, right? I also make the example in the article where in the the late 90s to early 2000s, we had the internet bubble, which there's always booms and busts in a capitalist society. In 2007, 2008, we had the global financial crisis. And journalists at the time, financial journalists at the time, were critiqued for not sort of sounding the alarm early enough for people to actually understand what's happening and for people to actually make decisions based off of reliable information. Instead, financial journalists at the time, what they did is they simply took that which financial analysts from big banks and big companies were saying and doing, and literally just reporting that as opposed to interrogating it further. So I would argue that that's another thing that financial journalists and the media should do as well, is to continue to actually start interrogating these financial analysts and the modes in which they operate within the financial system, in order for us to hold them accountable, as well as to keep the public informed, because that's so important. And I fear that if that doesn't happen, we could find ourselves in more crises that could have been preventable if those alarm bells had been sounded much earlier. But so that's what we really need to do, is to interrogate the system at a much more rigorous level in order for people to get reliable information that allows them to actually act upon it.
Yeah, and I suppose in this world of white-collar crime, that's what we call it, corruption and so on and so forth, one needs to explain what these crimes are, because sometimes they appear to have no victims, but actually they always do.
That's true.
Okay. Khanyisa, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating article that you penned. Thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Great. All right. That's Khanyisa Melwa, who says that financial journalism is needed much more at this time than ever before, and has to act as a watchdog for our society. But we really need to be explaining things in a way that the majority of us are able to understand. Right, it's time now for us to go into our news archives, and today we take you back to the 1st of May 1995, and that's when the newly democratic South Africa marked its first Workers' Day. This is how SABC covered that story.
Good evening. President Nelson Mandela was evacuated from the King Goodwill Zwelithini Stadium at Umlazi near Durban after shots were fired during a Workers' Day rally there. At least one person has been arrested and an unknown number have been wounded. The president had just completed his speech when single shots were fired and shot bursts of automatic gunfire were heard. Smoke billowed into the stadium from a shack that had been set on fire just outside. Police are reported to be holding about 500 IFP supporters in an adjoining part of the stadium. A 20,000-strong crowd had gathered at Umlazi Stadium to hear Mr. Mandela's address. He issued a stern warning to the Inkatha Freedom Party: if it continues to threaten his government, he'll stop funding its government. Referring to Inkatha's withdrawal from the Constitutional Assembly over failed international mediation on constitutional issues, Mr. Mandela said he was not going to ask the party to come back, but said he was prepared to hold talks to end confrontation and violence in the province.
In Port Elizabeth, workers gathered at the Dan Klekle Stadium to celebrate the holiday. Labour Minister Tito Mboweni said all workers, irrespective of race, must unite under one trade union federation.
We must ensure that we bring African workers together with African, coloured and Indian workers. This is important, comrades, because those of us whom we have deployed in the government cannot be able to sustain the momentum of transformation if our people, particularly the working people, remain divided.
Congress of South African Trade Unions General Secretary Sam Shilowa also committed COSATU to unity with other trade union organizations. Mr. Shilowa slammed striking workers who took hostages and resorted to violence.
Anybody who uses our weapon wrongly, we're not going to wait for somebody to deal with that person. Tinango kwetu, we will say you are misusing our weapon. You don't do that. Why do we keep quiet when people use violence during strikes and take hostages, then that thing gets used against us, those of us who engage in peaceful action.
Workers from all over the PWV converged on the Rand Stadium in Johannesburg to commemorate Workers' Day. The cold weather didn't dampen their spirits, and music from various artists kept the crowd entertained. But there was a serious side to the day's activities. The draft Labour Bill came under fire from COSATU's Ronald Mofokeng. He said the bill did not protect workers who had the right to strike. He also called for an end to the use of scab labourers during strikes. He assured workers that issues like the right to strike without fear of losing their jobs would be addressed. Gauteng's Premier, Tokyo Sexwale, also took a stand. He condemned yesterday's shooting at Katlehong between rival self-defense units and called on Gauteng's Safety and Security MEC to take strong action against the perpetrators of violence.
Fascinating, isn't it? And when I look at some of those faces back then, Tito Mboweni and Mbazima Shilowa, it certainly was an interesting time to have lived through. All right, we are going to start wrapping up the program, and what we do at this time is take a look at what's on the front pages of the newspapers today. And we go back to Glenda Daniels, who's been looking at the papers, and one in particular grabbed her attention, and that's the Sunday Times. Isn't that right, Glenda?
Yes, Peter. The Sunday Times did grab my attention.
Okay, what's on the front page? Because I know that that story has been carried in a number of papers today, and perhaps rightly so.
Yes, so the Zulu royals in court row is the headline story, and it's really about the succession issue that's going to happen, which would be of interest in particularly KZN, but obviously people are watching that. But, especially after the death of the princess and now what happens. But much more than that, regarding the Sunday Times, I was quite interested on two other particular things. One was the Zondo Commission and how the Sunday Times treated President Cyril Ramaphosa's evidence and testimony at the commission. They're quite critical of him. The paper's quite critical of him. There are many stories about that. In fact, the majority of stories on the Sunday Times is indeed about how he was treated. It seems to be that most of the paper says kid gloves, and he was actually interviewed in the 2 days this week on his as the president of the ANC. And they felt that he dodged a lot of things. In fact, it would seem that one or two articles were even saying that Norma Ngoma's evidence was much more interesting, full of candor, and gave you a lot more. However, of course, the president has to defend his organization. That's where he's coming from. It seems like he didn't give away a lot to say that cadre deployment has this effect and this is why it's happened. He rather defends the policy. And I think what the journalists are interrogating is that if the ANC has failed in so many ways, now the ANC itself is trying to rescue the ANC from the ANC. And so Ramaphosa is quite cagey on a lot of things. So we watch that space, and then
I suppose it comes with challenges. I mean, a lot of the witnesses have gone to the Zondo Commission in their personal capacities. They were accused of doing something, or they saw something individually, whereas he was there not as Cyril Ramaphosa, but as the president of the ANC. And therefore, you can't present and speak in the same way as we expected Nomam Ngoma perhaps to speak. Is that maybe perhaps where the disconnect is? Maybe next week it'll be different. Next time he's there is different because it'll be in his capacity as the deputy president at the time.
Yeah, I think so. Look, I mean, he did concede some points that I'm not here I'm not here to defend our mistakes. I'm here to say that, we didn't do enough, we didn't do this, and we could have done that, and we could have done this. But, on detail, he was cagey, not defensive. I mean, there was a lot of giggling here and there, and it was in almost a jocular spirit. Yeah. Quite soon after, we saw Masebenzi Zwane and we saw Brian Molefe. That's the best part for me in the Sunday Times, the Mampara of the week, the person who got onto a Gupta plane because he had a sore throat. I had to giggle. I mean, it's hilarious, And then that was the one issue. And then Brian Molefe, this is the power of unmediated media, where you just let a commission play out. Yeah. And you see for yourself where the eyes are going, how the ducking and diving is happening, how people are trying to cover up their own lies. And then a couple of days later, you will get different newspapers doing their own take on what's happening. So this is the example of something that gets mediated. The Sunday Times now giving its own take. Peter Bruce, for instance, saying that, in fact, Cyril Ramaphosa is asking the Zondo Commission to please do some work to get these, get the crooks to, because he started off his speech the day before, in fact, before he was even testifying, to say that corruption must stop, corruption must end. Okay. And,
so he's deploying the Zondo Commission. Glenda, we've run out of time. Always great to talk to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the program today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me. Goodbye.
Right. Bye-bye. All right, and that's how we come to the end of Media Monitor today. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. We'll be back at the same time next week with more of the same. In the meantime, please be careful out there. Take care. Bye-bye.